The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And welcome to Faith Matters for another year here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, pastor of Broad Creek United Methodist Church. Reverend Robert Cornegie with us from Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, associate pastor there, and also senior pastor at St. Peter's United Methodist Church. Carl Zorowski is with us, and Dr. Robert Wilson, Dr. Bob, as we call him, the author of Nullifying God. So, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Woohoo!
To all our listeners.
Both of them. So here we are on this day as we take on some other issues, and so to start off the year, we found some a variety of articles that kind of almost all of them end up down that apocalyptic theme. I know we say the sign of the apocalypse is for the last segment. We're just going to do
apocalyptic show.
Yeah, this is it. Okay, so let's start though with this from Crux, Taking the Catholic Pulse. And it's the article, Pope Francis slams false respect drive. No, I didn't want to start with that one. No. That one's coming up next. We'll start with this one. This is about Pope Francis, though. This is from Global News. It says, Pope says Christianity demands respect for immigrants, compares them to Mary and Joseph. Written by Philip Puella, probably. It's Pope Francis strongly defended immigrants at his Christmas Eve Mass on Sunday, comparing them to Mary and Joseph finding no place to stay in Bethlehem, and saying faith demands that foreigners be welcome. Francis, celebrating his fifth Christmas Mass as leader of the world's 1.2 billion Roman Catholics, led a solemn Mass for about 10,000 people in St. Peter's Basilica. The gospel reading at the Mass in Christendom's largest church recounted the biblical story of how Mary and Jesus had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be registered for a census ordered by the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus. So many other footsteps are hidden in the footsteps of Joseph and Mary, the Pope said. We see the tracks of entire families forced to set out in our own day. We see the tracks of millions of persons who do not choose to go away, but driven from their land, leave behind their dear ones, Francis said. Robert, I think a lot of folks have observed this story already, that being 10 days or so out from this story, is that he's conflating this story with the current situation of immigrants, conflating the biblical story, saying that Joseph and Mary were immigrants themselves. But that's not really what the Bible says, though, is it?
No, of course not. And he was trying to make a dramatic point and using a story that's in the news of this, why Jesus had to be born in Bethlehem, and it wasn't actually because of the census. It was because God was fulfilling prophecy,
right?
That he would be born in the city of David, Bethlehem. And so that had been foretold years and years, centuries before. And so that was it. So he was sort of
taking liberties,
evangelistic, in his use, evangelistic okay. In his use of Scripture, and kind of conflating those two. And as somebody that enjoys theology and reading theology and studying theology and believing in these things, it was sort of that sour note of the whole message. Look, I agree with his point. We need to be sensitive to the plight of the immigrants. Nobody's going to argue that. I mean, maybe there are some people that would argue that point, but I don't think most Christians would argue that point. But don't distort the biblical teaching to try to emphasize your point. That's when you get into trouble. So
Dr. Bob, you said you've observed this as a former Catholic. You observed that this social justice tendency, and in this particular Pope and Pope Francis, we have that liberation theology tendency as well.
Well, it's interesting because I was offended. I know this is a very up-to-date way to say things, but I was offended when I heard him conflate that, because I'm thinking, okay, yes, you're right, Pastor Robert, that that was God's plan to be there. But looking at it's almost secularizing the flight from to Bethlehem, because first of all, they had no choice in the matter. They were called by law to go there in a census. I mean, if you just want to forget the spiritual aspect, they were called to go there. Bethlehem was a very small town, I believe.
Tiny.
I had heard somewhere maybe around 400 inhabitants, and so there weren't many places for them to stay in the first place. And thank God they were able to stay where they were,
especially for someone about to give birth. Yeah,
right. I mean, but I love that part of it, because it says Jesus started out at the very, very, very bottom of everything, and that's who he is. So we can't say he was superior in that sense. But the thing that bothers me so greatly is that all of the spiritual aspect is lost in the way the Pope presented this. Yeah. And that's wrong. And it also does a disservice to those who are truly migrants, immigrants, that have to get out due to horrible conditions in the countries that they live in. But I'm sorry. This is where I take strong issue with what the Pope said. That's just flat out wrong.
I know, Carl, and some conservative commentators I know have made the point that is that really, if you want to argue this point, you could argue it from the left and from the right. You could argue that here they are being ordered to go back to the place of their birth. Right. It's being ordered to return to its place of birth. That might be one argument about, an immigration argument there. But then the other one says it's also a big government that's declaring that they must go back to pay a tax.
Right.
Correct. So these are actions. Now we know that, again, part of God's grand plan is at work here. But the secular actions which he is equating are really actions of government.
That's correct. And God can use the government to make those things happen. But now I shared before we went on the air, I was sharing that I always watch this Mass on Christmas Eve when I get home from church. It's absolutely beautiful, very spiritual, very uplifting. And when he began to give his talk and he began to talk about, equating Mary and Joseph to the immigration problem today, suddenly all of that spiritual aspect of the service just sort of was sucked right out of it for me, because I thought, I'm listening to a politician making a speech. And I understand in our nation we have a lot of issues around immigration right now. And a big part of that is whether people are illegal immigrants or legal immigrants, or I guess the nice way to say it is documented or undocumented. Okay, but this case, were these two migrating? Yeah, they were. They weren't where they were living. They had to go somewhere else. But they were doing it to obey the law.
That's a good point. They were obeying.
They were
the law.
Being obedient to the law. They were being obedient to the law. But then another thing that the Pope didn't even mention is, yes, there was no room at the inn or the home or wherever it was. There was nowhere for them to stay. But there was this stable or feeding area, and somebody, the way I see it, somebody said, you know what, we don't have room, but let me make room for you here. Let me do what I can to help you. So what we're actually seeing is somebody reaching out.
The hospitality.
And helping. Yeah. We're seeing hospitality. And then the shepherds being brought in. The Pope made a good point that they were sort of the outcasts of society. Mm-hmm. And here, they were the very first ones invited to come to see Jesus.
Right.
So there's a lot of reaching out to those who are marginalized. But I don't think that he was comparing apples to apples here by using this as using the modern immigration problem as a sermon illustration.
Well, that's it, isn't it? We are always all looking for sermon illustrations.
Right.
And
some of them are
some of them work, some of them don't. And unfortunately, this one didn't work because there are plenty of scriptures that address these issues.
Right.
You don't have to go and kind of scripture twist, if you will, to try to make it conform to this politically correct position.
But on the other hand, did the Pope do the church a service by reminding us that we do need to reach out to those who are displaced? Sure he did. Is that a message that needs to be heard?
Absolutely.
Sure it is. And I won't argue that at all. But somehow I just don't think that this was the proper place or time or use of Scripture to make that happen.
But there, if you extend the story and you talk about Herod then going after all the newborns, and that Jesus with his family, the Joseph and Mary, fled into Egypt, then you might be able to talk a little bit about people fleeing for their lives
if you picked up the
Right.
story
if you
and
picked
used
up,
it.
right, right. But even then, you have to look at people fleeing for their lives, not just to make a different income. So it's a different, maybe it's a different set of circumstances, and we certainly want to honor or extend hospitality to those who are fleeing for their lives, and we want to look at that seriously. So we'll have more to come in a moment here from Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Thanks for joining us here on Faith Matters on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240. I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegie, Reverend Carl Zarowski, and Dr. Robert Wilson, as we talk about other stories in the news here today. And continuing on kind of from our first theme is that Pope Francis had something else to say later on, talking about the holiday. We see this a lot. I mean, we all have this we've all had these discussions about saying Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, about just some of the linguistics of the holiday season. And we even, it may even come up, I know it came up in our church about using Xmas or not. And, so you get all these things. But to the heart of the matter, though, Pope Francis does express it in the online site called Crux, Taking the Catholic Pulse. Says Pope Francis slams false respect driving Jesus out of Christmas. Now, we've talked about this a little bit right before Christmas. We mentioned about how it seems like there's some movements that we have the movement Keep Christ in Christmas. It seems like there's some that are saying Keep Christ out of Christmas in many respects. But here we have Pope Francis saying that there's a false respect that isn't Christian, is his quote, which amounts to a desire to marginalize faith when people want to take Christ out of Christmas and simply just make it a secular holiday once again. Says his quote is, in the name of, and I believe he gave this on the Wednesday after Christmas, in the name of a false respect for non-Christians, which often hides a desire to marginalize the faith, every reference to the birth of Christ is being eliminated from the holiday, Francis said. But in reality, this event is the one true Christmas. Without Jesus, there is no Christmas, the Pope said, drawing strong applause from a crowd gathered Wednesday morning at the Vatican. If he's at the center, then everything around him, that is, the lights, the songs, the various local traditions, including the characteristic foods, all comes together to create the atmosphere of a real festival. So if we take Christ away, the lights go off and everything becomes fake, mere appearances. Mm-hmm. This is one where, Robert, we all agree, I think, with Pope Francis here. Even
President Trump
agrees
with that. That's the way the article opens, with a little quote from Trump. And I found that. I'm sorry, I just can't get past that. It was just amazing to me that they would throw that one in there.
Well, that's the trend.
Throwing the bone.
That's the trend.
To keep the hounds back.
Try and put Trump in every article. That's what we do now.
That's right. But, absolutely. I mean, that's it, isn't it? I mean, we have we have Winter Festival or whatever you want to call it now, where you have lights, and it's perfectly fine. It's, to put the lights on the trees and do all the gifts and all of that. And if you watch any television at Christmas time, and it starts at Thanksgiving with these sappy love story Christmas story. Have you seen these things?
Listen, I live with 3 females. Okay? The Hallmark Channel.
Oh yeah,
has burned the tube out of my TV this season.
And there, you talk about it's none of the Christian stuff is really in these things.
Yeah.
There's no mention of. They may sing some of the old hymns. They may get a hymn in there or two. They'll show the creche, they'll have the manger scene and all of that, but they don't talk about Jesus. They don't talk about any of that. It's all this emotional, gushy-wushy stuff. Yeah, and it's, it's just, that's really, I think, what, to me, when I read this, what the Pope said, that's, to me, it's sadly the Hallmark station at Christmas.
Right, and it's always that whatever is wrong, the magic of Christmas is going to make everything right. And I'm certainly not making any general statement about women in the Hallmark station. I'm talking about my family. This is the way it is at home. My daughters absolutely love it. But one thing in this article that popped out to me is where the Pope says, in the name of a false respect for non-Christians, which often hides a desire to marginalize the faith. What is this? I'm trying to figure out what he means by a false respect. Is that we as Christians are showing respect to them, and allowing them to be this way, but we're not really showing respect? Does that mean that we are being what? We're lying to them? We're being untruthful with them? Or is it that we think it's respect, but it's not really respect?
I think more that it goes to today's meme, we were discussing that before, of not being offensive, of being tolerant, of coexisting.
Exactly.
So we're not going to push our point of, quote, point of view. We're not going to talk about something that might upset them.
And so it's a critique, really, as much about Christians who do that.
Correct.
Who permit this idea that, I don't want to be offend my neighbors, so we'll just say happy holidays, or I don't want to offend anybody about what the true meaning of Christmas is. So if they just want to have the Hallmark Channel on or Lifetime movie on about Christmas that has nothing to do with Christmas itself, that's fine.
Yeah, there was a classic example of it yesterday in the Rose Bowl parade.
Okay.
Did you watch the?
No, I did not.
Did you have a chance to watch it? Okay. Did you watch most of it? Well, there was a float. I don't know if you saw it or not, but there was a float by the Lutheran Society. And it had, of course, everything's with flowers and whatever, all natural things. And on the float, they had, it was like the backyard thing or something, and they had this kid swing. I think that was the one. But anyway, standing at the top of this little rise on the float was a live character, Jesus, in a long white robe. It was the classic Jesus, real actor, standing up there, waving as he rode by, waving to the audience. And the commentators, the narrators of the parade were talking when that float came around the corner, and they started talking about the Lutheran Society, and they've been in it for 500 years or whatever it is, and 130 or something. I don't know what it is, but anyway, and they've had these floats in there, and they were talking about how they made all the different stuff. Never mentioned that Jesus was on that float. It was not talked about. And they went immediately to a marching band. It was amazing. And that's that sort of false respect that you're afraid politically correctness. You're afraid to say something that someone is going to take
that
offense
might
about.
be favorable.
I mean, to them, that was an offensive float.
It was. But in doing that, in taking that position, they are marginalizing Christians. I have seen more than one or two posts online where somebody puts out Jesus, a sign in their front yard, and the homeowners association says, take it down immediately or we're going to fine you.
Yeah.
Because other people find that offensive. No, I mean, this whole thing about Christians being marginalized, and here I'm talking about those who know Jesus Christ, who have a relationship with him, who know God is truth. People who say, look, this is the way it is, this is the gospel, but those people are being pushed to the side and don't talk about it at all. It's apocalyptic. I mean, seriously.
All right, here we are looking at it now into a new year. What do you think coming into 2018? Or is this another year where Christians get further marginalized, or is there now? You're seeing some pushback on this.
Well, we just got through Advent and Christmas, and in Advent, there's a lot of focus on John the Baptist, who is this voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. That is what each of us as Christians are called to be, is a voice in the wilderness. You follow Jesus, you begin a journey from where you are to where he wants you to end up. And along that journey, where are we? Well, we're like the Israelites. We're between Egypt and the Promised Land. We are somewhere in the wilderness, and we're called to be a voice crying out in the wilderness. So we can cry out and proclaim Christ, or we can be quiet. And I think what happens in the new year is really up to all of those who choose to follow Jesus. Are they willing to do this? We need to.
One of the devotionals I use daily is Oswald Chambers, My Utmost for His Highest. And on January 1, I read the devotional, and it's where he sets that utmost, the scripture base of that, where that comes from, and why we are to give our utmost for His highest. And that's exactly, you're absolutely right. That's the point, is that we represent the body of Christ. We are the body of Christ. And so how do we present him to the culture? And so I think, we have to be wise. We have to seek discernment and be led by the Spirit in this. And it isn't just being nice. There are times when you have to be, with gentleness and respect, but confrontational and corrective. And,
You look at some of the Old Testament prophets. What did they do? They gave a word that God wanted the people to hear in a particular place and a particular time.
Correct.
Isn't that what we're called to do?
Yeah.
I think one of the things about Chambers that I find so interesting, Chambers lived from about 1874 to 1917.
He was a young man.
And I've read both My Utmost for His Highest. I've also read a book of collection of some of the things that he had written. What strikes me is, over 100 years ago, he's talking about things that are contemporary, that are current.
Oh, it is.
So this is not something new that we're going through.
No.
I mean, it was there, maybe not as in your face as it is today, but this is not new.
And in fact, we just had the 100th anniversary of his death, and this is and his wife actually put that together.
Yes,
right.
Put the
Yeah,
book
that's
together.
right.
And fascinating stories around that as well too. Great, wonderful devotional. As we go into 2018, we have some other stories for you when we come back in just a moment here on Faith Matters. Hey, welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, joined with Dr. Robert Wilson, Reverend Carl Zarowski, and Reverend Robert Cornegy, as we talk about something that happened on Christmas Day. The Washington Post, which is the subject of a new movie that's coming out about the Post, and it has Tom Hanks in it, and
Mel
Streep.
And Meryl Streep, yes. And I guess I'm assuming he plays Ben Bradley,
He
the
does.
longtime publisher of the Post. And but this is from William Briggs in The Stream. The headline is Washington Post to Christians on Christmas morning. Jesus didn't exist. Early Christmas morning, the Washington Post thought it should stick its thumb in the eyes of those celebrating the birth of Jesus. Its official Post Opinions Twitter account tweeted, "Did historical Jesus really exist? The evidence just doesn't add up." Many commented on the provocative timing. Publisher of Encounter Books and author Roger Kimball said that the Post tweet was really all you need to know about that pathetic publication. Conservative actor James Woods tweeted, "Why is this necessary today? Why insult people of a certain faith on a day they most cherish? It's not a matter of being right or wrong. It's a matter of simple courtesy." This again, Robert, you had said you'd read this before. I think Dr. Bob, you said you'd read it too before I sent this to you about this editorial or this comment, and it goes back to our previous one about disrespect and then this false respect. Sometimes is that this is something. Okay, well, we're just gonna, this opinion is out there, so we must air it. We must air it. Is that, Carl, you see this as a thumb in the eye to Christians?
Very much so. I already had some concerns with the Washington Post, and now, this on Christmas Day of all days.
Are you going to cancel your subscription?
Yeah, I've canceled my subscription.
Good.
But, one of the things they talk about is that, there's no historical writings about Jesus, okay? And you've got the Gospels, but this comes from a misunderstanding of what the Gospels are. Mm-hmm. Okay, the Gospels were not written to be a historical text like a history book. They weren't written that way. That's not the literary form of the Gospel.
And the whole Bible written as a history.
Right.
Yeah.
And so here, these are people who their profession is writing. They should know about literary styles, okay? And the fact that they can't accept that these Gospels that were written all this time ago and have survived as long as they have and have shaped humanity as much as they have, how can they just dismiss them?
Well, I think one of the things that I would advise the writer of this article is to go in and look very carefully at the conversion of Lee Strobel from an atheist to the writer that he is today. His Case for Christmas, he's a good writer, by the way. I really respect that. But he has some information in there that you've got to take into account. And then, of course, there's Josephus. And the way the Gospels are constructed, whoever, if it wasn't Jesus, somebody coordinated all four Gospels in ways that you can't just dismiss. I mean,
right.
There's just looking at it from the outside, there is something here way more than just somebody scribbling down some words and saying, did Jesus really exist? There's no historical evidence for it. Well, I'm sorry. For a person like that, I question if there's any evidence that they would ever accept.
Gary Habermas is probably one of the leading experts in the church now on the resurrection. And Habermas has gone through, and he has a presentation that he does on, it's called the critical theory, and he goes to all the non-believers, biblical scholars, and uses their words, their conclusions, to build the case for the historical existence of Jesus. He doesn't use the wishful thinking side, as they would see it, the bias side towards Christ. He goes and gets their arguments, and he uses Ehrman from UNC at Chapel Hill, who is Bart Ehrman, who was a lapsed Christian who has built his fortune off of writing these books about the. But Ehrman says, of course he existed. Any legitimate scholar, biblical scholar, understands this. And so this guy Lasseter, or whatever it is going back. In fact, it says it in the article. He went to an article that was written 3 years ago And just repeat it. It's just like you said.
No new information.
Nothing new. It's just the same old arguments
And he
that
didn't
they keep
footnote it.
rolling out.
Yeah, and let's put this out on Christmas Day. We need
Christmas-
something for Christmas Day.
And they all do it. All the
And here it is.
mainstreams do it. You know, they all
that's
come
right.
up. PBS, everybody.
They got to fill their time on Christmas Day.
Yeah,
So.
they always do it at Christmas and Easter. You can count on it that they're going to come up and try to force their point of view.
Right.
The true
They
Jesus.
have an agenda that they're pushing, and so it is just
When
you just shake your head that these incredible journalistic, like the Old Gray Lady, the New York Times, and WAPO, Washington Post, and L.A. Times, and these have just gotten so.
The Guardian.
And here's what's fascinating about all this. I mean, there's a lot of things fascinating, but as Christmas approaches, and you're in the checkout line at Walmart or Food Line or whatever, and you've got all the magazines there, okay? All the magazines like Time, Newsweek, all of these, they have Jesus on the cover. And a big headline is, who was Jesus? Searching for the historical Jesus and all this.
Right.
And the world wants this secularization of Christmas. How many times do we see Santa on the cover of magazines this time of the year? We don't. But Jesus is all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, without Jesus, there's no Christmas.
The lights go out. That was the
right.
Pope's
lights
line.
go
I
out.
like
Just
that.
going back to the last thing we discussed.
Yeah,
What strikes me, though, is that going back to the article that we're discussing, these are the people who preach, I'm going to say to us, tolerance, respect.
Right.
Somewhere's in there, and I could be wrong because I'm not a great English scholar at all, but it seems somehow the word hypocrisy seems to creep in under the doormat there. I mean, this is wrong.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't creep in. It barrels in.
Yeah, it's
Well,
that
it's being
double
facetious,
standard.
yeah.
If they didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all.
Look, I'm hardly a scholar on form criticism, but a couple of things to note that I have learned a little bit is that the fact that there are the ancient writers writing about this lone itinerant preacher at all is evidence, because what were the writings about in those times? Were about kings. Were about the wars. Were about these grand things, not about some guy who shows up who preaches a good news of God. They aren't there. Those writings aren't there. Their rights. You look at Hammurabi. You go back and look at all the other ancient kings that were written about, and they didn't write about their failures either. They always wrote about their successes, or the tablets, or the different scrolls, or the different things that were out there. There were not these little country inconsequential tribes that were written about. These were.
It's embarrassing that Washington Post would put this up.
It is.
Seriously, this is really bad journalism. And they put it on their editorial page, I'm sure, because it's just terrible. Because the historians, Josephus, Tacitus, all these guys speak of him, and the early church fathers. I mean, there is abundant evidence of it, and the one thing is, there is history in the Gospels. I mean, it wasn't written as a historical piece; it was a theological piece. But there are elements of it: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they all talk about, and particularly Luke ties it to historical events. He gives names and numbers, dates. And so there is that in there. You just can't. And so what do they have to do?
But it's not its purpose.
In the authors of this article was just to discount them completely as biased and unreliable.
At the end of this Stream article, I think it's pretty telling. It says the Post's mysterious motivation was the caption to this last paragraph. It says, yet again, the Washington Post didn't bother to fact check this old story. Instead, it chose to republicize it on Christmas Day. Why? A clue may be at the bottom of the main article in the section, More from Post Everything. There we find links to similar articles, such as, I'm an evangelical minister. I now support the LGBT community, and the church should too. When my son survived a serious accident, I didn't thank God. I thanked Honda. So those are the links they put to similar articles expressing their similar point of view.
Well, Honda is a Japanese god, so.
All right, going to go there.
Well, it's interesting too that we're talking about opinion pieces. I know this is a little bit off topic, but it fits the same meme. One of the articles I use for the book was written by a Dr. David P. Barash, and you remember me mentioning him. Mm-hmm. The title of that article is God, Darwin, and My Biology Class. And that was an opinion piece in the New York Times. So this article is not alone in trying to marginalize, is in trying to neutralize, explain away, secularize the presence of Christ. Because as long as Christ is there, people can't really do everything they want. They control the situation, and therefore they are not accountable to anybody. And the problem with Christ is they are accountable.
You're right.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for joining us here on Faith Matters. One more segment to come, and it's a doozy. And that's coming up in just a moment here on Faith Matters. I hope you'll stay with us. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with the Reverend Carl Jarowski, Dr. Bob, and Dr. Robert Wilson, Dr. Bob as we call him here, and also Reverend Robert Cornegie from Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Islands. We talk in our final segment, which we finally called our Sign of the Apocalypse, although I think we've already visited that sign a few times in this program today. But let's take a look at a couple of articles. We'll try and squeeze a couple in. One comes from Crux, taking the Catholic Pulse. Topless woman's rights protester tries to steal Vatican's baby Jesus. That's all you need is the headline, isn't it? I mean, do you really need to know anything more than that?
Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas, yes. Police on Christmas detained a member of a women's rights group after describing itself as composed of brave, topless female activist after she attempted to steal the baby Jesus figure from the nativity scene in St. Peter's Square, protesting what the group claimed is the Vatican's infringement of the rights of women to own their bodies, to their own bodies. The group, known as Femin, cited the Catholic Church position on abortion and birth control for its motives for its actions. What happened was that this woman is Ukrainian, self-described a sex extremist, she calls herself, was like wearing a raincoat, and then it was over by the nativity scene, and at one point strips off the raincoat, and it says that she's naked or topless anyway, with the written on her torso is "God is woman," and runs in and grabs the baby Jesus. It sounds like the adult version of the worst Christmas pageant ever. What was that program? It sounds like something that would be captured on video, would go viral from some odd Christmas program somewhere. But this was someone who is declaring their right to upset other people for what I think Dr. Bob, I think a lot of people would say is the false notion that the church doesn't care about women.
Well, you know, Ed, we're talking about rights. Ann Landers some years ago said, "Your rights end at the tip of my nose." I think that's very wise. In other words, you have every right to throw a punch if you want, but they end right there at the tip of my nose. So here is this woman saying, I've got rights. That's fine and dandy, but not when they infringe and jump into the middle of other people's rights. That's the problem now.
And
it's just fascinating, isn't it? Yeah. How it's become theater now, and that it really isn't about the issue. It's about getting on the news. Mm-hmm. And, the place was, the square in front of St. Peter's is huge. And I'm assuming they still do the creche scene like they did. I mean, it's been years since I've been there and seen it in Rome, but it was big. I mean, it's life size.
That's where at the end of the Mass, when the Pope carries the baby Jesus out and he lays it into that manger scene.
Yeah.
It's life size.
Yeah, exactly. And it's there. And they're surrounded by tens of thousands of people that are waiting to hear the Pope bring a message. And she pulls this little stunt. And my goodness, Well, first of all, that they actually left the word men in their group name, FEMEN.
Femin, yes.
I mean, that just blows it. Who can take them serious if they leave men in there? Because, it should have been FEMYN.
Yeah.
Because that's the proper way to get kind of clear.
Okay, sure.
So once, if they, they're just not a serious group. It's really not serious.
They posted a message explaining the attempted theft, saying, "A child is not from a god, but from a woman, for a woman is God." So, again, this is, like you said, it's really hard to take much of it very seriously. Their arguments kind of all over the road and not particularly well focused. But here they are stealing the baby Jesus out of there. And what did they think was going to happen?
Well,
they get
she
on the
was going to
news.
get arrested. It was going to be on the news, and she knew that at some point we would be talking about it on Faith Matters. So it was all about
us.
It was all about getting on Faith Matters.
She's been online.
Listeners.
She's been on YouTube and seen our program. And so
that's right. That's exactly right.
Now this article out of the Hartford Courant is actually an article that had been nationwide. I was trying to find one that was a little more particular about it, not just the Associated Press article. But it says, petition to grant 3 Goshen elephants legal rights as persons denied. The petition to grant 3 Goshen elephants legal rights as persons was denied by a judge at Superior Court in Torrington on Tuesday, court records show. In a memorandum of decision, Judge James Benavegna cited the petition, called the petition wholly frivolous on its face in legal terms. The Non-Human Rights Project filed the lawsuit on November 13th, arguing that Beulah, Karen, and Minnie, 3 elephants captured in the wild and now living at the Comerford Zoo in Goshen, are legal persons with fundamental rights, and they must be released into a sanctuary. Person is not a synonym for human being, but designates an entity with the capacity for legal rights, the lawsuit claimed. It claimed that it had the ability to have empathy, complex communication, remember the past, plan for the future, mourn their dead, and so that made it persons. Mm-hmm. This is what we go to. Everybody just shakes their head.
This truly is a sign of the apocalypse.
Well, here's one thing. These elephants they're talking about, these elephants had spent decades in the circus. And now they're not in the circus. And they're somewhere where they're being cared for and living a very wonderful life.
Right.
So it seems to me like things are going well for these elephants right now. Okay. And this whole thing about, that elephants have legal rights, these different animals have legal rights. Is that going to outlaw my going fishing on my day off?
Yes.
You betcha.
Yep.
It will. We, working in the laboratory that I did, I worked with a lot of animals, mice particularly. Mm-hmm. But we were always we always kept our eyes open for the animal rights people. One of them, Professor Peter Singer up at Princeton University is a big one on that, because the way it works out is that if we all come from a bunch of gases that just evolved, then we have no more rights than an animal does. So animals have as many rights as we do, which if you think about a jellyfish, I'm not sure I would agree with that. But technically...
Or a mosquito.
They are animals. Okay, technically. So where do you draw the line? You can't be selective. If you're going to say the animals like these elephants have rights, then where do you draw the line? It's ridiculous.
Well,
you don't.
That's part of it, is the wish for the line to be completely obliterated.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's their theology. What is their theology? That there's no difference.
Who is their God?
Right, exactly.
Right.
There is no God. So, we're all just meat machines. So whether you have fur all over your body, or how many legs you have, or if you have a beak, or if you have, whatever, you're just a collection of molecules, molecules in motion. And so, hey, how can you arbitrarily, one group of molecules, say that it's superior to another group of molecules? So everybody's just molecules in motions, and molecules are in motion are people too.
I like that phrase, Robert. Molecules in motion. That just
I need
has
to
a
get a
nice-
few
I
mine
stole
in
that
motion.
from Frank Turek. So anyway,
Well, let's go back. Let's go back to the creation account. Okay, Judeo-Christian teaching on the creation is that, and I'm going to be politically correct here, humankind was given dominion over the animals. And it wasn't just to be able to make decisions for the animals. It was to care for the animals, to be stewards for the animals. And yes, we need to take care of the animals in the world, but we were given dominion over them. Okay, and so the people who are trying to, as Ben said, obliterate that line, well, they're going to dismiss this whole creation account. And I guess that's where they come from, because we all came from this primordial ooze, and two cells came together, and then it morphed into something else and evolved into something else. And here we are, and we're just the ones that got privileged enough to be standing upright, opposable thumbs, and be able to form our own government. Right?
I think one of the things that gets me too is that I think back to the creation account, and I went over some things like this. I mean, God, in chapter 1, 7 times it says, and God said. And then 5 times it said, and it was so. Just like that. But the big one is, and God breathed his own breath into man, who was formed from dust.
From dust.
That gives us something above and beyond any animal. God's own life is in us.
well, that's the part they really hate, is that we claim to be bearers of the image of God, and our claim is based upon what we believe is reality. That there is a distinction, and that our purpose, that our work on earth is to be the stewards of the earth, to care for the earth. And when we find animals like elephants being misused and abused, then we are the ones who are to step in and protect them, because they can't, protect themselves in many of these cases. And so, that's the part that they miss completely. And so we need to really help them. That's why we need to speak up and form other organizations.
But the Washington Post will tell us that there's no footnotes in these
That's
books,
right.
creation accounts, so they don't count.
See you next week on Faith Matters.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.